And I'm going to discuss the early works by Stanisław Lem. I mean the works from the period between 1945, 1946 and 1950, but I will start with the beginning of the 1970s, and then I will explain why. At the turn of 1972, Michael Kandel, then a young professor of slavistics at Indiana University, wrote a letter to the already getting famous Polish science fiction author Stanisław Lem, enclosing his essay about Lem's writing. In January 1972, the author wrote back with a long letter in Polish, not only highly appreciating the essay, but also making a straightaway proposal. Although Kandel's essay contained no quotations from Lem's works, and therefore no samples of Kandel's translational skills, the writer, who had been very dissatisfied with the English language versions of his fiction, asked Kandel to re-edit, and he used actually this word, re-edit American translation of the novel His Master's Voice, being then prepared for publication. In response, the critic instantly sent him his translations of some stories from the Siberiad and Star Diaries. It's sort of picaresque and very difficult to translate works by Lem. This way, they started an exchange of letters that continued for several years, forming the largest volume of Lem correspondence with a single address, some 700 pages, and one of most interesting. Soon, Michael Kandel became Lem's most favorite translator. Their correspondence is so interesting not only because of the topics of literary translation and interpretation of Lem's works, and the writer's opinions about his publishers, the critics and reading public, but also because of something much more personal, Lem's attitude towards his origin. As a man of Jewish descent, born in a country infected with anti-Semitism, who miraculously survived the Holocaust with false Aryan documents, actually Armenian documents, and after the war decided to keep to his safer non-Jewish identity, whose wife and closest friends were ethnic Poles, who even in his fiction, one may say from the dangerous earth to the stars, Lem was nonetheless tempted to return to everything he had abandoned. And it seems that for years he had nobody to talk about it. So when he had formed a safe, remote relationship with his American admirer, he made the most of the opportunity. Michael Kandel, much younger than Lem, a Polish speaker, so somebody with whom Lem could fully communicate, but neither Pole nor German, and possibly a Jew. Kandel was a common Jewish name in former Austro-Hungarian Galicia. Kandel was an ideal partner for the confessions Lem had not been ready to make before. Yet the writer, always reluctant to refer to his Jewish origins, remembering the fresh experience of the anti-Semitic campaign of 1967-1968 in Poland and the neighboring countries, and aware that the censorship would probably read his mail, was very cautious. In his letters to Kandel, he applied the strategy of partial, indefinite self-exposure. During the first 15 months of their correspondence, he went all the way from generally raising the topic of mass killings and the Holocaust, through discussing the works of other Jewish authors writing in non-Jewish languages. For example, Mr. Zamler's Planet by Saul Bellow and Hard to be a God by Strugatsky brothers. He mentioned that almost all his family, and I will quote here, was killed by Germans, mostly gas death camps, end quote, and remarking that he had never wanted to visit the museum in Auschwitz, and again, quotation from Lem's letter, I do know all this first-handedly. It's Lem English, because he wrote in Polish, but he put some fragments he formulated in English, and especially the fragments, the parts of the letters referring to his Jewishness and to the Jewishness at all. Finally, he decided to declare openly, but again in English and not in Polish, and with a reservation. In the spirit of Nuremberg laws, I am a Jew. And it was more than a year after they started the correspondence, and Lem wrote few letters in a month, during a month. Simultaneously, Lem tried to sound out if his correspondent was actually a Jew himself. This was not the sort of question you ask straightforwardly in communist Poland. So he used different tricks, like the intertextual shibboleths alluding to the works of Bellow and so on, I've mentioned above, or the suggestion that Kandel's sensitivity to the nuances of Polish language was so extraordinary that even most Poles don't have such an ear for the language. The subtext read, only assimilated Jews, like the poets Julian Tuwim or Bolesław Leśmian, could have this sort of an ear to the language. Kandel must have confirmed somehow Lem's guess about his lineage, for 1 year later, the writer ventured to discourage Kandel on emigrating to Israel. I've started this paper with the resume of the Lem-Kandel correspondence to show how difficult it was for Lem to deal with the problem of his ethnic origin, even when he already became an internationally recognized author. And it had been much more difficult to address the issue at the beginning of his writing career and in front of Polish reading public. In the country devastated by war, with its educated classes largely destroyed by the Nazis and the Soviets, after 5 years of racist propaganda, of victimization and brutal extermination of the Jews, anti-Semitism was widespread and often aggressive. Assaults, murders, and even regular pogroms happened. In August 1945, at the time when Stanisław Lem and his surviving parents repatriated from Lviv to Kraków, a synagogue was set on fire, 1 Jewish woman was killed, and several other persons were wounded in the streets of this very town the Lems had decided to settle, Kraków. The biggest pogrom took place in Kielce, 120 kilometers from Kraków, in 1946. During it, about 40 Holocaust survivors preparing for emigrating from Poland, mostly to Palestine, Israel, were killed by mob and by communist militiamen. Among the victims was one of Lem's relatives. No wonder that Lem's short stories, novels, and poems, he wrote some poems, not very good though, from this period, this initial period of his writing career, contain only indirect references to his Jewish experience, or more precisely, they contain references to the Jewish experience, but it is presented as an experience of somebody else's. In his thriller and spy stories, this is what he wrote mostly at this time, for money. In his thrillers and spy stories, published in popular magazines between 1946 and 1948, Lem tells a repetitive, multivariant story of a young male hiding his identity in a hostile milieu during Second World War. The character may be a Japanese living among the Englishmen, or a Scot among the Germans. By the way, Scots seem to be Lem's favorite surrogate for Jews at this time, being British but not English, just as assimilated Polish Jews were Polish, not in the same way as the ethnic Poles. This person, this character, either has to pretend someone else than he really is, which causes constant fear of being unmasked, or despite his loyalty to the society he assimilates into, is treated by his environment with distrust and contempt. Good example combining these two situations is the story A Man from Hiroshima, about a British Japanese called Sato Whitney, who at the break of the war becomes a spy working for the Allies in Hiroshima. The narrator of the story, British intelligence officer who has recruited Sato, sympathizes with him when he is humiliated by his European companions and treats him as a Brit. Still, he is unable to warn Sato before August 6, 1945, and moreover is forced to watch a TV broadcast of dropping the A-bomb on Hiroshima. When the narrator later visits Sato, dying of radiation sickness in a hospital in Japan, Sato looks just as other Japanese victims. He's not British anymore, neither for the others nor for himself. Sato bitterly observes, the Germans couldn't be killed like that, for they were humans, and we are only Japs, or yellow men in Polish original. It was not translated into English and into any other language, I think. Towards the end of the narrative, he declares to the narrator that he was actually a Japanese spy, not a British one. This story about the impossibility of assimilation, about racist degradation and rejection of individuals, and the humanization of whole groups, enabling their mass killing, and last but not least, the storytelling about witnessing deaths of your folk or your friends, and about returning to one's ethnic identity as the result of these experiences, certainly fits into one of the typical patterns of post-Holocaust Jewish narratives. The only difference is that Lem conceals his personal identification with the victimized, under the guise of universal humanism and sympathy. It is no different in his best known and probably the best novel from this early period, and the only one to be translated into English, Hospital of the Transfiguration, written 1948, published 1955, telling the story of a mental hospital liquidated by the Nazis during the Second World War. There, the author also uses a mask, disguising the final solution to the Jewish question as the Nazi euthanasia of the insane, Jewish ghetto as the psychiatry hospital, and himself, former medical student, Lem received medical education, as a Polish doctor, Stefan Trzyniecki. But perhaps the most striking example of Lem's substitute Jewish narrative, as I would like to call this sort of telling and at the same time not telling about your experiences, is the socialist realist sequel to the Hospital of Transfiguration, written according to Lem's statement only for the purpose of convincing the editors and censors to allow the publication of the Hospital of Transfiguration. I mean the trilogy of Among the Dead and Return. All three books were actually published together in 1955. It is an account of further life of the young doctor Stefan Trzyniecki. In Among the Dead, Stefan still is an ethnic Pole, yet because of his appearance, several times he is mistaken for a Jew in the street, and having endured the passers-by passive hostility, he is later betrayed to the Germans as a Jew by some Polish children and arrested. Humiliated and beaten, he ends up in a death camp, Belgians probably, or there's even the name. He ends up in a death camp where miraculously and against all historical likelihood, he becomes the only survivor from the group with whom he arrived. Subsequently transported to Auschwitz, Stefan becomes a camp doctor, and then he is incorporated into the Sonderkommando. His task is to extract gold teeth from the corpse's mouth. So he is a witness not only to mass murder, but also to the process of production involving the use of human bodies and the transformation of scraps of victims' clothes, hair, teeth into useful objects. After the war, in liberated Poland, he works as a doctor in a hospital, but every now and then he experiences anti-Semitism of his compatriots just because of his looks. So everyone know or can perhaps check or ask if he's Polish or Jewish, but he looks Jewish and he's treated as a Jew. Totally unbelievable in its Holocaust part, the story of Dr. Stefan Trzyniecki seems to be told solely to document the tragic fate of European Jews, the fate Stanisław Lem shared only to some point. At his worst moments, being simply the worst moments of Jewish Holocaust experience, Trzyniecki, Lem's alter ego, the name Stefan begins with the same sound, the same letter as Stanisław, and it's only one of the signals. So Lem's alter ego comforts himself, even in Auschwitz. I am lucky that I am not a Jew. So he shares Jewish faith, Jewish experience, but he's conscious that he's not Jewish. It comforts him. Is it, on the author's part, only a wishful thinking of a person who fantasizes about how it is not to be Jewish? Or perhaps there is in this statement an awareness that he, Stanisław Lem, and his likes, those assimilated, educated, Europeanized, coming from wealthy bourgeois families, speaking good Polish or German, were not really, or not completely, or not only Jewish, and that it was much easier for them to survive than for those who couldn't pretend somebody they were not. In the last part of this socialist realist saga, entitled optimistically Return, there is a strange episode involving an old Jewish cemetery, becoming an obstacle in the development of a new communal housing estate. Untypically for a surrealistический roman, the architects discussing the problem don't bring the popular slogan of the time about changing cemeteries into gardens. Rather, they get reflexive, muse on the possibility of moving whole cemetery to some other place, so not to destroy it, and even think about the second dying of those lying in the graves who have nobody to remember about them. In the episode, we read also about that between the housing blocks and the cemetery, in the narrow space between the housing blocks and the cemetery wall, there is a strange square hollow that opens in the ground. As it appears, there were plans to build a playground or a pool there, but for some reason the pit, looking very much as an empty grave, a huge one, stays as it was. And again, despite the socialist realist conventions, the question what should be done with the old cemetery and the hollow, the strange hollow, remains unanswered in the novel. Both motives, the abandoned cemetery and the strange pit, resembling of some contemporary Holocaust memorials or the Ground Zero in New York, actually, for us, seem to be symbols of Lem's complicated attitude towards his Jewishness. On the one hand, it's something he and his family had more or less intentionally abandoned. On the other hand, it's something he understood that Jewish history, and especially the Shoah, this hollow, the crypt in the project of Western civilization, cannot be ignored or used in any practical way, that it stands in the way of progress and demands response, also artistic response. Cryptical metaphors rooted in Lem's war experience and reflecting his problems with the Jewishness keep reappearing in his mature science fiction works. But it is another story, only partly told by Lem's biographers and literary scholars. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this intriguing paper. Questions, comments, remarks?
I have read that similar problem had Herring Grudziński, who tried to hide his Jewish origin from father's side.
Yeah, but I think Henryk Grudziński didn't try to, because Lem, he was hiding this problem and his war, Holocaust traumas. But at the same time, as I tried to show to you, he tried to expose them in some other ways. And Henryk Grudziński, as far as I know, he didn't, he had this Gulag trauma and he was not, during the war, he was in the Soviet occupied part, not in the Germans occupied part of Poland, and so he didn't actually suffer because of the Holocaust. So perhaps this is the difference, and I think he had a personal sort of identity problem, but he didn't address it actually, and Lem did.
And I saw the interview with him, with Herring Grudziński, and the journalist asked, "Are you Catholic?" He said, "Yes." "Were your parents Catholics?" He said, "No."